React, class component state. Why do we care about state? Well, components take care of themselves. This means that each class component must keep track of any data it uses. This is its state. So any data within a component is its state. However, there's a problem. We can't just change data whenever we want, because React controls all components. React handles rendering. This means that any activity that happens with rendering may or may not happen before any data within a class might update. Which is to say, if we start changing data, it might show up during the render and it might not. Or it could, or it might not. So we don't have a control over when React handles rendering, when it calls the render method of a class component. It controls all of that by itself. So to help with this, React provides setState. SetState inherits from the parent class component. So when we extend component, we also get setState with that. This updates the this.state internal object in a class component on a fixed schedule. So whenever we call setState, we give it, say, hey, update this value. It will then call render by itself and update the code. This provides us with a fixed schedule to understand how this will react. Pun intended. So we can then update a value and it will re-render by itself. There's a little bit complication with this though. We got to remember some steps. So if we're going to use setState in the class component, the following steps are needed. We have to create a constructor. Within the constructor, we have to create this.state, and as part of render somewhere in here, or as part of something it calls, we call set.state to update the values in this.state, which will recall render and set everything off again. So let's look at a code example in Visual Studio Code to walk through how this all works. So I'm going to move over to Visual Studio Code. And you see we have a class component right here. So again, as a double check, I have React, import React, which we will always have. And then I have a comma and then component. So notice right here, I'm importing in component. Notice the little curly brackets around it. And I'm down here, class component with the keyword class and extending component, which of course makes it a class component. So I also have, as part of all of these, must have a render function, and the render function should return JSX HTML. So right here, I am returning HTML, and I have a render method, and everything seems to be okay. But I want to add state to this class component. So our steps were, first one, create a constructor. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to give myself some space and I'm going to create a constructor. Now, Visual Studio Code is smart enough that once you start typing something, it will take a guess at it. So constructor. So in this case, I'm going to call this props and I'm going to define it right here. So remember, a constructor is a special method of classes that constructs. It does the building part. So I understand that JSX, when it's converted, converts between elements and attributes into objects and properties. That last word there, properties, is important because I'm going to call this props. Now, class app extends component. So I'm going to type super and props. Now notice something weird just happened. It just put a line through this. And in fact, if I put my cursor over it, it'll tell me it's depreciated and I probably shouldn't use it, but that's actually not important right now because what it's telling me is you shouldn't just have it with nothing else, and we're about to add some extra stuff here. So step one was to add a constructor. Step two is to create this.state, and almost always we will set it equal to an object, and right here an empty object, open and closing curly brackets. Now we could use an array here or some other data structure if we want, but usually, almost always, we'll want an object. So I'm going to give this object a single property called counter with the initial value of 0. So we have this.state dot counter, because this dot state is the property, and because it is an object, it has its own property, in this case a single property called counter. So this dot state dot counter, which is equal to 0. So what I want to do down here is I want to show that value. So remember, if we want to show values, we use JavaScript Expressions. It's part of the 3 rules of JSX. We need one root element, which we have here. We have a single division as the root. All elements must close. We've got divs close and our header close. And the 3rd rule was JavaScript Expressions, which we include within curly brackets. So I'm going to add a paragraph tag, and it will provide the closing tag for me. And I will write counter, or here we'll just write count, colon, and this dot state dot counter. And noticed how Visual Studio Code was helping me along there because it guessed at what I was doing. So we have count, and we have this dot state dot counter, which is right here. Counter is equal to 0. I'm now going to save this. So in Windows, Control S. Now notice down here it recompiled successfully, showed us in green. Everything seems to be working correctly. Let's double check that in Firefox. So I will pull up Firefox here, and we see count 0. So fantastic. It seems to be working correctly. So let's go back to this right here. So we've created our initial state as part of constructor. So the steps were create a constructor, create a this dot state inside the constructor, and then now we're on part 3. Part 3 reads, as part of render, call set state to update the values. That's what we want to do. So we can't just call set state randomly. And we can, but it won't work correctly. Instead, what we usually want is some type of interaction. We want the user to do something which causes a value to change. That's usually what we want. So I'm going to create a button, and I want to listen for an event. The event I want to listen for is a click. So I'm going to write an attribute on click, notice it guessed at what I wanted, is equal to, and again, JavaScript Expressions, rule 3 of JSX, are in curly brackets. So I'm going to say increase, and that will be the text on the button. So what do I want to happen? Well, this will be an event, so I probably want an arrow function right here. And so what do I want to happen? So okay, every time we click this button, I want this .state.counter to increase. So I can do that through calling this, there it and it guessed at it, this .setState. So what do I want to update? Well, I want to update this .state, which is an object, so curly brackets matching that. And I'm going to say, hey, counter is equal to this .state.counter plus 1. So the current value right here, this .state.counter, increase it by 1 and change the corresponding property. Notice these are the same name, counter and counter, by 1. And I'm going to save this file by pressing Control S. So what I want to happen is every time a click event happens on this button, call this arrow function. Inside this arrow function, call this .setState. SetState is part of component, which means we automatically get it because we are extending component. Then I want it to update. Well, set this .state is an object. And so notice the little curly brackets right here. So what I want to update, I want to say, okay, this is an object. So what I want you to do is update to another object right here, where counter is equal to, counter right here, is equal to this .state.counter, its current value, plus 1. So if I've done everything correctly, let's move over to Firefox. And what should happen is my count increases as I click this button. So let's move back over to the code. So back over here in Visual Studio Code, Let's go through our steps again to create state, and then we'll talk about event one more time. So, components take care of themselves. We know that. We've heard that multiple times now. Any data within a component is part of its state. We have a class component. This is a class. It extends component. It's a class component. Self-explanatory title there. We want to add data within it. So because we want this, we need state. So this requires 3 steps. First one is create a constructor if it doesn't already have one, which is the first thing we did. The next thing is we create this .state, which we have done right here inside this constructor. And the third was somewhere in render's down here, we call this .setState. Again, setState is inherited from component. Again, we get everything component has and we extended it. So app gets everything component has. SetState is part of component. So what we wanted right here, we showed, hey, we set up state, and then we immediately used it initially, this .state, that counter, which showed 0, and it worked perfectly. Then we decided we wanted to change state, and so we did that through creating right here a button. This could have been something else, could have been any element in fact. We gave it an attribute of onClick, which means anytime this is clicked, do something. The thing it did was an arrow function right here. I'll highlight the whole thing. And inside this arrow function, we called this.setState, which again was part of component. We said, hey, update state right here, this.state, to match this object where counter is equal to the current value, this.state.counter, which we saw right here in the previous example, +1. And so run all together, then we could keep clicking the button every time we want, which we'll call setState every time, update the current state, this.state that is, to a new counter with a new value. So put all together then, we realized we can use event handlers and we can use state within class components by following the 3 steps I outlined. And if you're confused, you can also go back to the earlier slides. But the steps were to create a constructor, create this.state inside that constructor, and then somewhere as part of render, call this.setState, remembering that it's this.setState. So the other thing that's a little bit tricky is this thing right here. So you may be asking, why did I use an arrow function? Well, if I did not use an arrow function, it would fail. So you may be asking, why didn't I just do this right here? Which is to say, why didn't I do this? Well, it's wrong to start. You'll notice how it's giving me a bunch of errors and it says, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. You can't just do that. So I have to, or in fact, let me Control Z to fix this, do something like this. And you may say, oh, well, why couldn't you maybe just take out the extra curly bracket and then take out the other thing and just say, hey, why can't you just do that, right? So even trying to fix it, you say, okay, well, everything compiled, this would work, wouldn't it? Let me show you something. Let's move over to Firefox and notice, oh boy. So something happened here. Maximum update depth exceeded. So let's refresh and oh boy, threw a bunch of errors. So what exactly is happening here? Well, what's happening is it's attempting to render this button, which is attempting to do onClick stuff, which is calling setState every single time, which is also updating this, which is calling setState, which is also updating this, which is calling setState, which is also updating this. And that's where the problem lies. So let's rewind this a little bit to this, and I'll resave. So we use an arrow function here, and this is particularly important for class components because arrow functions bind this to the current context. Now, if you don't care about that technical reason, very simply, make sure you have an arrow function as part of whatever the event is. arrow function, and then inside of it, you can use the this referring to the class itself. The technical reason why we do it is because arrow functions this bind to the current context in which they are written, not that in which they are run, which is a lot of technical jargon to remember and can basically just say, hey, do I need to do something with a click? I probably just need an arrow function, and inside of that, I can use the this that refers to the class. Again, a lot of technical way of going about just saying that. So this has been a review of state within class components. Again, there's multiple steps for this when we use it. Not only do we need to create a constructor, we also need to create a this.state, and then we need to use this.setState to update the this.state we created, which is me saying this a lot. So multiple steps to do this, not terribly complicated, but some multiple steps to do it, and some other little things to remember when we do it. But if you're ever confused, again, you can refer back to this example or the slides, which walk you back through the 3 steps we need and this example code right here.